All right, and we're good. So, if you're joining us for the first time this week, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. We're going through the book of Romans, and we've covered to this point over, I guess this is week 3, week 4, something like that. We've covered the introduction of the book of Romans, tried to orient ourselves a little bit to the background of the book, the thesis of the book, and basically what we've tried to argue is Paul is writing to a particular situation to Jews and Gentiles in the church at Rome. And we could actually say to the churches at Rome, they had many different, what we might call house churches. There may have been some larger congregations and homes that were larger, but there were many different gatherings of Christians, and those gatherings oftentimes fell along the lines of Jew and Gentile. And so Paul, in an effort to unify the church, as well as an effort to prepare for his own missionary endeavors, wrote the book of Romans to give the church a theological foundation, as well as to simply serve them, to make sure that they weren't falling into error. And so we said that the theme of the book of Romans, if we had to pick one umbrella theme, kind of the fountain from which all other things flow, the theme is the gospel. And we see this in the introduction where Paul talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ. He talks about him being descended from David. Then in his thesis statement, which begins really in Romans 1:16, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And so that issue of Jew and Gentile is going to be huge as we seek to understand the book. But as we think about the gospel, what we basically argued is this, is that gospel is a huge umbrella term. The word gospel means good news, but it's the good news of Jesus coming and securing the promises of God through his blood. And when Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel, he's saying that in one sense in a defensive posture, saying of his Jewish brethren, hey, you guys shouldn't be ashamed of Jesus either, even though he's not the Messiah you expected, even though God's plan did not unfold the way that you predicted. Don't be ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he says, for it's the power of God unto salvation for all who believe, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And then last week we really unpacked this idea, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it's written, the righteous will live by faith. Big picture idea here is that the righteousness of God essentially means the rightness of God's plan in fulfilling the promises the way he did. In other words, the Jewish people would have looked at Jesus the Messiah, they would have looked at the good news, and they would have said, listen, if Jesus is truly the Messiah, if the Gentiles get to come into faith, then God's promises to Israel are null and void. Jesus says, no, this is actually the righteousness of God revealed. He's fulfilled his promises. He's offered salvation and life to Jews and Gentiles, and he has done it not simply by sending Jesus as the Messiah, but by sending him as a sacrifice, an atoning sacrifice for sin, so it is from faith to faith. It's our faith in Christ that then allows us to participate in the covenant blessings that Jesus secured for us on the cross. And so that's his thesis statement. It's about the gospel. It's about the righteousness of God. It's about the glory that God receives as he sends Jesus to die for our sins. And it's about now our participation in the kingdom of God, particularly through the church that Jesus created. So if this is your first night, that was just kind of a recap of where we've been. There's a lot of things that have been said, but here's where we're coming to tonight. We're coming to really a big reset moment in the book of Romans. And when I say reset, here's why. Because Paul gives us kind of the banner, here's the gospel, here's the good news, but now as we turn to verse 18, he's going to kind of pull a trick on us. Because he's just told us the righteousness of God is being revealed, but now in verse 18, he's going to switch and he's going to talk about the wrath of God being revealed. So before we understand the righteousness of God, Paul essentially is saying to us we have to understand the wrath of God. Before we get to the good news and the true goodness of the good news, we have to understand how bad the bad news is. And so I just want to say this up front. As we look through these verses tonight, my goal is going to be to get to the end of chapter 1, and I think we're going to be able to do it. But as we look at these verses, they're going to contain many different things, and as is often the case with Paul really doesn't say anything that is uncontroversial, okay? So as we look at this, pretty much everything that we're going to talk about tonight was a hot button issue in Paul's day, and guess what? Is still going to be a hot button issue today. And so my goal is to really take us through the text, to talk about the text, try to unpack what Paul is saying, to do so in love, to do so in truth, but really to come to an understanding of how the wrath of God is being revealed. And so I want us to start in verse 18. We're going to take it just bit by bit, and then we'll go through maybe at the end and try and read the whole thing to try and understand kind of the scope of his argument. But let's just go ahead and read verses 18 and 19. It says, "For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them." Okay? Now, there's a lot here, and I want to start by just considering what does it mean that God's wrath is revealed, and even before that, what is God's wrath? And this is where it's so important for us to take a step back and recognize that it's really improper for us to attribute human constructs, human emotions to God. And here's why I say that. When we think of wrath, like if we use the word wrath, that's basically a way that we say someone's really, really mad. You're going to feel my wrath, right? If someone's really, really mad, then mad isn't the right word, wrath is the right word. And when we think of really, really mad, we often think about a human being who, because they're so mad, they can't even control themselves, right? I was in a rage, I was wrathful. And so that we use phrases like fly off the handle, or we use phrases like uncontrollable rage or rampage. When we think of wrath, we think of someone losing control. But actually, the exact opposite is what we should understand when we think of the wrath of God. You see, the wrath of God is not God losing control. The wrath of God is actually demonstrating his control. And as we think about the wrath of God, we're really meant to see it as the other side of the coin of the righteousness of God. And here's why. Because God cannot be righteous unless he has a righteous hatred or a righteous aversion to sin. God cannot be truly just if God does not hate injustice. So the righteousness of God, and think, this, I really believe this is how Paul's trying to present it. We can't truly understand the righteousness of God unless we understand how that righteousness is made clear or manifested by his wrath. So the wrath of God is not God flying off the handle. It's not like God woke up one day and, I need to beat someone down. I need to send a lightning bolt. And listen, that might seem like a caricature, but here's what I want us to see. For many of us, that is the idea of God that for better or for worse has seeped into our consciousness. That we think the wrath of God it almost means that God's just waiting for us to mess up, and so he zaps us. Or if we've kind of said, okay, well, I'm a Christian, so I'm good, we kind of think of the wrath of God as God waiting to fly off the handle and just, boom, 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 fire and brimstone someone else. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying that eventually that judgment does not come in incredibly fierce ways. It does. But as we're going to see here, God actually reveals his wrath, not first through fire and brimstone, but actually he reveals it in a patient way that gives people opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to repent. Which is why it says the wrath of God, it doesn't say it's hurled from heaven. It doesn't say that God just throws down from heaven immediately. It says it's revealed from heaven. And then it says against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So just to sum this up before we go on, wrath is not capricious anger. That just means it's not something that's kind of, goes with the wind. And some people are just angry people who you never know if they're just going to wake up and be in a bad mood. That's not God. God's anger is rather a settled, necessary, and holy opposition to sin. It is the necessary act of God that he hates sin. Why? Well, first of all, because God himself is holy and sin is unholy, but also because sin does incredible damage to all of the goodness that God created. And therefore, God's wrath is revealed against all unrighteousness. But let's go on and let's try to understand what Paul means when he says that those who are unrighteous suppress the truth. He says it's revealed against godlessness and unrighteousness, but then he makes this claim because he says people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And this gets to Paul's vision of the effect of sin, both on our person, so there's an effect of sin on us physically, on our minds, there's the effect of sin on us intellectually, but even more importantly, the effect of sin on our hearts. People call this, in kind of technical theological terms, this is the doctrine of total depravity. And the doctrine of total depravity is a fancy way of saying not that people are as bad as they could possibly be, thank the Lord, but it's a way of saying that sin and the effect of sin does truly impact every part of who we are. That when Adam and Eve sinned and when we all followed in their sin, it's not only that the consequence or the wage of sin is death, but it's actually that sin distorts and breaks the world, even at the level of our mind and our hearts. And so when Paul says that by their unrighteousness they suppress the truth, he's saying that we all have a tendency, think of it like this, we all have a tendency because of our human fallen nature to see things in alignment with our will and our desires rather than seeing them along God's will and God's desires. You could say it like this. If there is a compass that is our heart and our mind, our compass is broken. It does, our mind and our heart, our human nature does not naturally lead us to the truth. It is naturally bent toward unrighteousness. And think of this, because Paul's actually making a further claim, that because it's bent, because it's not broken, we actually have an incredible ability to suppress the truth in our unrighteousness. In other words, the kind of tabula rasa, right, this blank slate idea that human beings start out good, they start out in neutral, and then eventually, based on their choices, they kind of tend one way or the other. Paul's view of human nature and the view of human nature we see in the Bible is not that we start out a blank slate. It's that we actually start out, think of it in a car analogy. With your car, if your tires aren't aligned, they're going to go off the road. We start out with misaligned tires, but we could say it's stronger than that, right? Our hearts are bent toward evil. And listen, that doesn't mean that every thought, every deed, everything we do is the most evil thing it could be. That's the grace of God that restrains us. But it does mean that our hearts are fundamentally broken, and the condition of our hearts, and here's why we can truly say it's evil, the condition of our hearts is fundamentally self-focused. It's self-centered rather than God-centered. And because of that, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, as we read this, please know, this is not Paul, and everything that we're going to read tonight is not Paul telling us, I want you to have an us versus them attitude where we are good, but those people out there, they're bad, right? It is not that idea. Paul is trying to show the position of every single human, both individually and corporately. That guess what? Individually, we're all broken. And when we come together, we're all broken. Right? And this, by the way, I really see resonances of this. I put it in a different slide, but I'll say it now. This is the story of creation all the way to the Tower of Babel in Genesis 1 through 11. Adam and Eve sinned individually, but what happens? The world becomes so bad so quickly that taking a piece of fruit and eating it becomes killing your brother, becomes now we have polygamy and the oppression of wives in Genesis chapter 4 with Lamech. We have violence spread all throughout the world in Genesis 6 before the flood. And then on the other side of the flood, even after God's punishment came, it says that all of the people came together to make a name for themselves. They tried to build a tower toward heaven, essentially usurping the throne of God. And God comes down and he says, oh my goodness, it's not just that individuals are bad. When they come together, they do bad things together. Our bentness, our brokenness is both individual and corporate, which is, again, why we need the good news of the gospel. But here's where Paul is going to get serious very quickly. Because Paul's not going to pull his punches. He's going to describe the extent of the way we suppress the truth. because we're bent toward evil, we have a great ability to ignore what, according to Paul, God has made plain. And he starts with God's revelation through creation. Now, I want you to notice this language. It says, and I'll go ahead and read verse 19. It says that we suppress in unrighteousness the truth, since, Paul says, what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen through the creation of the world, being understood through what has been made. And as a result, people are without excuse. Now, I want to kind of try to parse out, again, bit by bit, some very important words that Paul throws in here. The first thing I want you to see is this. It says in verse 19, God has intentionally shown himself. Okay? So this isn't like, oh, there happens to be breadcrumbs that God left. No, God is intentionally trying and seeking to and intending to reveal something about himself to us through what has been made. And this is where we talked about this, right? Theologians talk about two different kinds of revelation. There's natural revelation, which is open and obvious to all people at all places through all time. This is the revelation of God in creation. This is the revelation of God through the created order. It's natural revelation that's open and available to every human who's ever lived. On the other side, you have special revelation, which means the revelation of God's word, where guess what? Not everyone has God's word. Not everyone has access to it. But here's what Paul is saying, that through creation, every single person has some access, has some awareness of the invisible attributes of God. And notice that. Do you notice the play where Paul says God's invisible attributes, those things that we can't see about God because we're separated with God through sin, God has now shown us through what has been made. So we can't see God, and that's the hang-up, right? A lot of times. We can't see God with our eyes. Why? Because sin has separated us from him. Notice, by the way, that Adam and Eve could. Like, it did not take Adam and Eve faith to believe in God's existence, right? I mean, they literally got to see him. No faith necessary. But for us, because of our separation, even the basic fact of God's existence is something that we have to accept on faith. But here's the good news. God has revealed himself to us so that we don't have to take a leap of blind faith, right? This is, by the way, there's a group of people known as the New Atheists. They were kind of popular 10 or 15 years ago. They're really kind of irrelevant now. But here's what they said. They said belief in God is essentially the same level of leap as belief in, you may have heard this, the flying spaghetti monster, right? So if you ever hear the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, it's a real thing. It's just a group of atheists who like to make fun of Christians. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, their whole point is belief in God is irrational. But that's where Paul comes and he says, of course, he didn't know about the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I don't know if they had spaghetti in Paul's day. But here's what Paul says. Belief in God is something that we can see. Why? Because he has shown it to us, and he has shown us God's invisible attributes through what has been made. And then Paul gives us two different invisible attributes. What does he say? His power and his divine nature have been clearly seen through the creation of the world. And this is where Paul doesn't get into like the depth of argument that sometimes we see among apologists today. And the word apologist, by the way, means a defender of the Christian faith. They give us a lot of detailed arguments about how the world began, when the world began. There's a lot of logic that goes on in that and a lot of argumentation. We'll talk about actually a couple of these in just a second. Paul doesn't get into that detail. He just basically says the creation of the world itself demands an explanation. And God is the explanation. That's where Paul leaves it. He says God has revealed himself through the creation of the world, his power and his divine nature. And that raises a big question. What does Paul mean by his divine nature? Well, I think at least part of that is to show not just that God had the power to create, but what did God create? God created a world that is beautiful. It's full of glory. It's full of beauty. This is why when we see the stars, we think, man, there's something more out here. You don't have to be a believer. You don't have to be a Bible to have a spiritual experience in nature. This happens all the time. The awe of nature, right? This awareness that something is going on here above and beyond random chance. This is what Paul's saying. His divine nature, his qualities as God, his power are on display through what has been made. And notice he says they've been clearly seen all the way from the creation of the world. And this is key for Paul because Paul wants to say, and he's really setting himself up for this next phrase, being understood through what has been made, and as a result, people are without excuse. Now, as we think about this, right, this opens up a lot of things. Does this mean that we understand every mystery of the universe? Actually, no. The more we learn about the universe, you know what we find? The more we actually don't know, right? The more we learn, the more questions we have. Now, here's the thing. Does that mean that like Christians are anti-science or anti-knowledge? No. Actually, of all things, Christians should be most comfortable asking those questions. Why? Because we actually think they lead us somewhere. Paul says those lead us back to the Lord, ultimately. Now, does that mean that it doesn't require faith? No, it does. We don't get to see. And why don't we get to see? We don't get to see because of sin. Sin does separate us. But this is where faith is, again, the antidote, not because faith is illogical. In fact, Paul says the opposite. Through creation, he says, men are without excuse. In other words, no one is going to stand before God one day and be able to say, you know what? Belief in you was just something that I never thought about, I never considered, it never crossed my radar. Like the excuse of being able to stand before God and say, God, I had no reason to believe in you. God is going to say the entire world is a reason to believe in me. Again, that doesn't mean that every mystery about the universe is solved, and Paul doesn't try to do that. But I do want to just talk to you for a few minutes. There are different arguments that apologists use in terms of trying to show, and this is kind of a fine-tooth distinction, but I do want to make it. When it comes to the idea of belief, there is a whole branch, like the study of belief and the study of rationality is a philosophical branch known as epistemology. And in that, here's basically what Christian apologists try to do. They try to say, listen, when you think about belief in God, like if someone said, okay, can you prove to me beyond a shadow of a doubt, can you prove to me definitively that God exists? For one, if someone asks you that, you can first of all just tell them your story, tell them your testimony, tell them your experience of God. That a lot of times is actually more effective than trying to kind of logic chop and kind of go tit for tat. But here's what apologists will do. Most of the time, they aren't interested in trying to say, prove God through, say, if you're familiar with these things, there's an ontological argument, which is basically a very rationalistic philosophical argument to prove that God exists. But most of the time, apologists don't go for proof. Here's what they try to go for. They try to go for, well, what is the best explanation? In other words, what is the most rational explanation for all the things that we see? What accounts for them most logically? And this is where I gave you three of them. Okay, in the world, this is known as the teleological argument. In the world, we see order and purpose, right? All the way from the subatomic level to the level of the universe. We see order, we see beauty. We see, we see electrons dancing around nuclei. We see entire galaxies that are spinning in orbit around other galaxies. Like at every single level of creation that we can see, there's this incredible order. At which point, we would say, okay, well, what's the most reasonable explanation? We see order because there was order embedded into creation. That's the essence of the teleological argument. Or what about this? Beauty. It's not just that we see order, it's that when we see the world, we see a beauty that calls for an explanation. Why is there beauty? Why do we get to experience beauty? And this is what I go back to, whenever we think of these kinds of arguments, there is a kind of knowing that is beyond, and I'm going to use a word here, beyond empirical knowing. Empirical means provable, repeatable, something that you can do in a lab and do it over and over again, that you can get the same result every time, okay? Those things are important. Those things are good. But let me just ask you a question. If I were to say to you, how do you know, and again, this is the inference to the best explanation, how do you know that your spouse loves you? How do you know that? Well, the answer to that is not because I can prove it in a lab. Like there is, and I mean this. I'm going to press the point a little bit, like because someone can say, well, I can prove that. I look at what my spouse does. Okay, well, how do you know your spouse isn't just tricking you? How do you know that your spouse isn't just messing with you because they want something from you? How do you really, like when you get down to it, how do you know? Well, that's something that at the end of the day, you've just got to trust. They can show you all the evidence in the world, but there's still at least the hint of a shadow of a doubt that love is not true love. You've got to accept that to some degree by faith. And here's what I say. There is just a kind of knowing that can never be empirical. There's a kind of knowing that is a different kind of knowing altogether. And that's where the idea of beauty comes in. But then there's another interesting one, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This was actually the one that really got C.S. Lewis. Here's what C.S. Lewis said. He believed that the existence of God was something that we could derive from a knowledge of morality that we all have. And here's what he said. If we really come to the conclusion that some things really are good and some things really are evil. In other words, it's not just that something's preferable. It's not just that something is something I like and someone else doesn't. If there really is an objective good and evil, then from that we have to conclude that something makes it good and evil. In other words, I'll share this story. I have, again, a good friend, not a believer, grew up in church, ended up leaving the church, had some really bad experiences, went astray. And he's someone who, I don't know even exactly what he would call himself, but he would not call himself a believer. And he was trying to say one day, and this is very common in our culture, we were talking one day, and he was just like, Tim, he's like, honestly, I just don't believe in right and wrong. I don't believe in right and wrong. And I said, well, and I won't say his name, I almost did, but I said, hey, I was like, listen, I really think you do, whether you say you do or not. He's like, no, I really think, if it's good for you, if it works for you, if it makes you feel good, if it makes you happy, then that's what makes it right. And I was like, well, wait a second. I said, he was a good friend, and he'd share with me a lot of his life. I said, wait a second. Like, you had an ex, I don't believe they were married, but I said, you had this ex, right? And you remember whenever that ex cheated on you and lied to you? Like, you're telling me that you would say, actually, no, that's just, well, if it works for her, right? And he said, honestly, you're right. He's like, I really do think that was actually wrong. And here's the point. It's really fashionable to say, like, oh, right and wrong doesn't exist. It's the thumbs up theory and thumbs down, the yay, boo theory. This is kind of postmodernism, if you're familiar with that term in a nutshell. Postmodernism says there is no right and wrong. It's just I say yay to some things and I say boo to other things. You might say yay to different things and I might say boo to other things. But here's the point. C.S. Lewis said, if we really come to the conclusion that some things are truly right and some things are truly wrong, and you could, the example that's thrown out a lot is Hitler killing millions of people. Truly wrong. If you don't have a basis for saying yes or no, then something is going on where we would say, if you can't really say no, it's not just that I think it's wrong, or it's not just that everyone thinks it's wrong. It's that even if no one thought it was wrong, it still is wrong. And because of that, Paul essentially says, we all have a moral compass. We all have a knowledge of God that at the end of the day, because we're made in the image of God, we can't suppress fully. So that would be the moral argument for God's existence. By the way, that picture, you might wonder why I chose that picture for the slide. Here's why. That's a picture of deep space. You can see in there, it almost looks like a distortion. And this is where I love it, because actually what that is an effect called gravitational lensing, where there are gravitational objects in space that are so massive, not all of which are even visible, but so massive that they actually bend light as it moves through space. Like, the mysteries of the universe are so incredible that we look out in space and all over the place there's light just bent because of the massive objects that are out there. But the point is, God has given us enough in terms of his natural revelation to all people so that we don't have an excuse. No one will be able to say before God, belief in you was irrational. No one will be able to say that because of what God has done in creation. And I think that's important. We're going to move on. But I think that's important because if we want to understand the rest of Paul's arguments, we've got to understand that all of them are tied to how Paul envisions God creating the world. So everything that we're going to see is essentially Paul saying God created the world, he created it very good, and slowly but surely in their suppression of truth, we shouldn't say there, we should say in our suppression of truth, in our unrighteousness, if God's creation is true north, we slowly but surely have drifted from that. And this is what he's going to argue in verses 21 through 23. I'll go ahead and read it. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show him gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. Again, you see the effect of the mind, their thinking became worthless. You see the effect of the heart, their senseless hearts were darkened. And then in verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. So again, this goes back to the old story in Genesis 1 through 11, which is essentially everyone's story. We substitute the truth of God for the lie that we prefer. Rather than following God, and notice it says rather than glorifying him as God, which glorifying God, by the way, entails and implies submission to God. We can't glorify God if we see ourselves as God, and that's the point. What did Adam and Eve do? They essentially tried to become like God themselves. But God says you can't do that. You cannot submit to me while also trying to define your own reality and your own destiny. It's impossible. And so it says, for though they knew God, they did not glorify him, intentional choice. Instead, their thinking became worthless, their senseless hearts were darkened. And here's where Paul says, the effect of sin, the more we bite into the fruit again and again and again, it's not just that we die, it's that effect of sin continues to get worse and worse and worse. We sin, it continues. We sin, it compounds. And it affects our minds, it affects our hearts. And here's why. Because when we sin again and again and again, it abandons the source of wisdom. It abandons the source of life. And that's why when we think of God's design, God designed our minds to be attracted to him. He designed our hearts to be honed in on him. He designed even our bodies. Think of this. Jesus says, love the Lord with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Even with our bodies, we are designed to do what? Serve and worship God. And so whenever we deviate, whenever we defy that natural order, whenever we replace God, and notice what he says, with an idol of our own making, when we drift, there are going to be effects. There are going to be consequences. Notice the irony in verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools. And think about this. This is, I really believe, an echo of Adam and Eve coming all the way through. They ate the fruit. Why? Because Eve thought, it's delightful to the eyes, but it's also good for making me what? Wise. The temptation was that they could achieve a wisdom for themselves that was distinct and separate from God as the source of wisdom. The temptation was that they could have a life that was apart from the life that God had given them. So thinking that they were going to be wise, thinking this is good, this is what we need, this is my autonomy, this is my independence, thinking it was right, claiming to be wise, they actually became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God. And notice even the subtle comparisons. The immortal God, The invisible God, the all-powerful God, the immortal God for what? Creatures, animals, images, he said, resembling mortal man. Think of that, worship of self. And then creation, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Paul here is saying, think about how foolish it is to exchange God for creation, to exchange creator for created. And yet this is what, and please hear me, this is what Paul says we have all done. This is what sin is. This is the nature that we've inherited. This is the position we all find ourselves in. And because of that, verse 24, then God delivered them over in the desires of their heart to sexual impurity so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. And they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served what had been created instead of the Creator who is praised forever. Now, think of this again. If we're going to understand God's wrath, remember, all of this falls under the umbrella of God's wrath is revealed. Here's where we see it revealed. It's not that God throws fire and brimstone immediately, but what does it say? It says God essentially took his hands off. And this is what some people refer to as the passive wrath of God. I think that's a little bit too strong. But essentially God says, okay, if you want to exchange the truth for a lie, that's how he described in verse 25, I will let you do it. God, notice the language, gave them over to the desires that they had. Okay, if you think you're wise, I'm going to let you go. If you think that's what you want, I'm going to let you do it. Does anybody hear an echo of the father and the prodigal son story here? Father, give me my inheritance. Okay, I wish you were dead. He thought he was wise. He thought, think of this, he thought he was free. Meanwhile, his freedom was actually his bondage. What he thought would satisfy him was actually the very thing that was destroying him. And in all of the craziness, the father who should have said, of course you can't have your inheritance. How disrespectful, get back to work. His father said, here it is, go. He gave him over to the desires of his heart. And this is how God's wrath is again revealed. He essentially says, if this is what you want to do, go for it. And then what do we see? He gives an example where it says there, he gave them over to the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. I actually think, my brother makes the joke. He says, Tim, you have an ability to relate everything to Genesis 1 through 11. And here's why. Because it does all go back to Genesis 1 through 11. It's because it's true. He made fun of me after a sermon one time. He said, all right, everybody, open up your Bibles to Luke, and here we see Genesis 1 through 11, right? No, here's why. Think of this. Even in the story of Genesis 1 through 11, we see essentially at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, what does it say? It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives from among all whom they choose. Now, that's a lot. But the sons of God, this is complicated, but not really. I think the sons of God refers to actual human beings, okay? And I think that for various reasons, but very briefly, because Genesis chapter 5, which flows into, obviously, Genesis chapter 6, describes humans as those made in the likeness of God. And it says Adam is made in the likeness of God, and guess what? Seth, his son, is made in the likeness of Adam. So then in Genesis chapter 6, when it says sons of God, I don't think it means demon monsters. I don't think it means angels in that context. I think it means men, humans. And it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, a.k.a. women. And it says they saw that they were beautiful, and they took from among them all that they chose. And that word all, I think, implies not just polygamy, but basically rampant sexual immorality. And I think that really helps explain why the flood comes. Essentially, it was total anarchy where humans were doing whatever they wanted, including violence, including sexual sin. And again, I think that that's echoed here. I think that's what Paul's saying. That the same thing that was true in Genesis is, by the way, not just true in Genesis, right? When you talk about, again, God gave them over to their desires. And notice he says the desires of their hearts, and then he refers to sexual immorality. Interestingly, he doesn't say the desires of their body, which again tells us the desires of our body are tied to the desires of our hearts. Now again, talk about controversial, right? That apparently it's not just my body is telling me something and then I have to follow my body, but actually our bodies are tied to our hearts and our minds. And this is, again, something that the Bible teaches consistently. We can, in one sense, kind of separate body, soul, and mind, but in another sense, you can't separate them. They've been fused together. But we need to move on. God gives them over to the sexual impurity. And then in verse 25, it says they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Actually, it's interesting, in Greek, that is literally the lie. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie. Well, what is the lie? It's idolatry. It's the idea that you can really worship yourself or you can worship creation, but it's the idea that idolatry is exchanging the truth. And notice, it's the truth of God, the truth that God has revealed, for a lie implied of your own making. It's the idea that you get to craft truth for yourself. It's the idea that you get to make it up, that you are the master of your fate, the captain of your soul, right? That is the idea. Now, this is where we get to a really important passage in verse 26 and 27, and it's very important for a number of ways, but if we want to understand it rightly, we have to understand it in the context of Paul's argument. Paul is now going to show an intensification. He's going to show again the principle that when you continue into sin and you keep going and you keep going, sin has the kind of appetite that is never satisfied. And so he says, here's what we say in verse 26, for this reason, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, for this reason, God delivered them over to disgraceful passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. The men, in the same way, also left natural relations with women and were inflamed in their lust for one another. And men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty for their error. Now, to state the obvious, this is talking about what scholars call homoerotic behavior. And the reason why many of them refer to it that way is because there's a distinction. When we think of homosexuality, we think of it in terms of a sexual orientation. We say people are gay or this person is gay. And I think it is very important to clarify up front. In Paul's time, there was no conception of a person having a sexual orientation. That was a foreign thought. Now, even as I say that, the idea of homosexual behavior was well known in Paul's day. Like this is, and this is something that we need to, I think, remind ourselves of. Homoerotic behavior, or we could say male-on-male sexual behavior, female-on-female sexual behavior, that is not new. That is not something that we are dealing with. That's not something that was it's even not a new argument that it was somehow normal or natural. How do we know? Because we see it right here in Romans 1. Okay? But here's how Paul sees it. Paul says, okay, when we think of our bent, when we think of our human nature, we have a great ability to justify things in our mind that align with our own appetites. Okay? So he talks first about normal sexual immorality. And when I say normal, I mean the heterosexual sexual immorality. But then he goes on to say, as people, again, drift farther and farther, and please, I hope you see this and I hope you understand it. As people drift farther and farther from the natural created design of God, they are going to experiment with things that are more and more distant from God's original design. Okay, so then we ask the question, what is God's original design? Very clearly in the garden, you have one man, one woman, one lifetime. That's God's design. Okay, you start to drift from that. What do you have? Well, then you have men taking multiple women, right? And then you have men and women both doing basically whatever they want, right? There's a country song, follow your arrow wherever it points. That's basically the idea. Do whatever you want. Why? Because you're exchanging the truth of God for a lie. The further you distance yourself from God's created design, the more you have to feed the appetite, which is why, again, look at how Paul describes it. He says that God delivered them over to disgraceful passions. That idea of disgraceful basically means things that are distant from God's created order. Their women exchanged, again, there's the word, natural relations for unnatural ones. The men, in the same way, also left natural relations with women and were inflamed in their lust for one another. In other words, the sinful appetites of immorality or sexual immorality were not satisfied, and so the search continues. It moves on. And then what does it say? Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. Now, if you're following along at all, if you have a pulse right now, you know there's a whole lot of things that are very controversial in here. Not just about homosexuality as an act, but also about what it means that someone receives in their own body the penalty of their error, okay? So I want to talk about this, and this is, again, I don't know that we're going to make it through the end, because I do want to have some time to talk. But I want to at least explain a couple of things. First of all, there are many people today, and people who I would say love the Lord, who argue that basically, even as clear and plain as this is, in terms of its statements about homosexual behavior, here's the arguments that some Christians throw out today. They say Paul here is talking about a rampant or indiscriminate sexual life. In other words, they say Paul is not talking about a committed relationship to someone of the same sex. And so they would say Paul's condemnation of these sexual behaviors is a very specific kind. Essentially, they would say it's not consensual. Maybe it was someone using power over someone else. Maybe it was they would say this is not talking about consensual, permanent homosexual relationships. This is basically how the argument has progressed in Christian circles. And here's what I would say. The reason that's not true is because it doesn't take into account at all Paul's way of arguing from created design to the distortion of created design. In other words, you can't say, well, Paul, and this is how people argue, they would say Paul never had a conception of homosexual marriage. That's true. I don't believe Paul ever had a thought about homosexual marriage. But I believe he did have a thought about how this kind of behavior does distort the original design that God had. Now, and this is a shame that we're not going to get to the end, because I want to say this up front. Paul here in a moment is going to give us a list of sins that all distort God's created design. He does use sexual sins as an illustration. But again, this is not Paul saying us and them. This is how Paul says we are all distorted when it comes to our own bent desires. And let me again go to the language of natural and unnatural. Think about this. Our culture tends to argue for the rightness of homosexuality because, ask Lady Gaga, right? They say we're born this way. In other words, if I'm born this way, if it's natural to me, then that must mean it's right. At which point, here's what I would say. We have all kinds of natural desires that are not righteous. In other words, I don't deny, and I would never, and I want you to hear my heart in this. I really do believe there are people who have genuine same-sex attraction and have always felt that. Other Christians say that's not true. I do not say that, and here's why. Because I've talked with teenagers who say, listen, I'm attracted to someone of the same sex. I don't have any problem in my theology saying that there could be a natural bent in that direction. Here's why. Because all of our sexual desires are bent and distorted. And here's what I mean by this. Guess what is not natural? Monogamy. And again, this is going to be controversial, but what do I mean by natural? I have never met a man who is only naturally attracted to one woman. Never met someone who has a natural desire that is completely righteous. But does that mean it's right? If I have a natural desire for a woman that's not my wife, does that mean it's righteous? No, it doesn't. And here's what I would say. The fact that our natural bent might be different, it doesn't change whether or not the behavior is sinful. But because, and please hear me, because I have a very robust understanding of how deeply broken the world is, I believe that there can be deeply distorted desires. In fact, I don't just believe it, I know it for all of us. And here's what I really do believe. And I believe it's a mixture of nature and nurture. I do. But I also believe, because I've seen this, people don't get to choose their struggles. They don't. And so even if someone were to come to me and they would say, I have this natural desire, here's what I would say. There are all kinds of desires that we all have because we live in a broken world that we don't get to say, well, because that's natural to me, that means I get to give into it. We all have to learn to crucify what is natural to us that is not in alignment with God's design. And as we look at this, we see that Paul gives a list. I'll go ahead and read it. They are all filled with unrighteousness, evil, greed, wickedness, envy, murder, quarrels, deceit, malice, gossip, slanderers, God-haters, arrogant, proud, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. I truly believe what Paul is trying to do in that moment is intentionally cast the widest possible net. Why? Because he doesn't, and think of this, Paul's design is not to give us a verse that we can take and use as a weapon to say, we're better than you. No, if that's the way we read it, we miss Paul's point. Paul's point here is to say, we all have distorted, unnatural desires that have drifted from God's design. Now again, what I do believe Paul's arguing is saying, as we succumb to those, as we give in to those, right? Then we become much more prone to take the next step and take the next step. And to go back, to make us all a little bit more uncomfortable, if you're already not already, right? Please think of this sexually, because Paul talks about it sexually. Once you have, and this is just a natural human reality, right? Once you have experienced something sexually, you can't put that back in the box. It's not possible. Once your body begins craving something, it's going to crave it. And this is why when we think about our own desires, whether it's homosexual, heterosexual, whatever, once you have experienced something that gives you sexual pleasure, everything in your body is hardwired to want it again. And that's where, in terms of Paul, I really do believe that one of the reasons Paul talks about this is because he wants us to see that even what some would consider the worst of all sexual perversions is not beyond the grace and mercy and love of God. And why do I say that? Because in 1 Corinthians 6, he actually says this. Do we know that there are homosexual people, or we should say people who struggle with homosexual temptation that can be true believers? The answer to that is definitively yes. And here's why we know that. Because Paul says there were people like that in the church. He says it in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9 and 10. Again, in a list of things, Paul says, such were some of you. He names a long list, but among that list, right in the middle, is he says, and you can translate it various ways, I'll just say it pretty plainly, men who have sex with men, is how he says it. You can look it up, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, I didn't put it in the sheet, but it's there, you can look it up. But here's what he says. In that long list, he includes that, and then he says this at the end of it. He says, and such were some of you. In other words, do we know there were people who struggled with what we would call same-sex temptation in the Church of Jesus Christ? The answer to that is absolutely. And we don't even have to guess, because it says it right there. And such were some of you. Now again, we have to try to understand this from the fullest possible biblical perspective, which I really do believe, again, is that created order is the true north. And it's so embedded in creation, and this will be my last thing, and then we'll talk for a minute. Paul says they receive in their body the due penalty, or the due, I don't remember what my translation says, the due appropriate penalty of their error. Here's what Paul is saying. Again, if God's design for our bodies is the true north, then just like when we deviate from God with our intellects, just like when we deviate from God with our hearts, when we deviate from God's plan with our bodies, the further and further we get from the design, the more and more we're going to experience the consequence of that deviation. In other words, I don't believe this is like God actively and intentionally saying, okay, if you do this, I'm going to send you like a particular evil, bad thing. No, it's that God, again, gives them over to the desires of their hearts. And what do we know? The farther we deviate from God's design, the more drastic those consequences are always going to be. And that's not just true sexually, right? If you lie, one lie's bad, but you know what's worse? 10. Okay? And you could multiply that times as many sins as you want. The further you go, the further you get, the more drastic the consequences will be. Bodily, Paul says it. He says it in 1 Corinthians. That when it comes to sexual sins, sexual sin has a particular sting to it. Why? Because your body really is rewired when you have a sexual experience. That's how God designed it. He designed it to be good, but because of sin, there's a distortion. All right, I'll be quiet because I do want to leave a few minutes for questions. Again, amazingly, we didn't get as far as I wanted to, but we'll hopefully finish Romans 1 next week. I know this is a lot, we've got like 3 minutes. That's fine. I'm going to stay afterward, but any thoughts or questions or responses at this point? My main desire is that you see the flow of Paul's argument from creation and how his statements fit into that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that, except I would say we do have a tendency to think that the challenges that we face are totally new. And what I mean by that is we tend to think that, say, the whole issue of homosexuality is something that other people didn't have to deal with. And I think we see in the first century, there was rampant sexual immorality in Paul's day. So, there's this old famous quote, right, that someone said the youth of today are disrespectful, they're, do whatever they want to do, they don't listen to their elders, they don't care. It's a quote from Socrates, right? It's like, so yes, I believe that's true. I do believe that there is a drifting that naturally takes place. But I also think that sometimes we don't recognize that human nature is incredibly powerful. So I'm not disagreeing, but I'm saying I think it's also important to recognize we're not the first people and we're not the first Christians to have to think through these issues. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, Caitlin. Yeah, so this is, and I agree with this. Romans chapter 1 tells us there is enough of an awareness of God to make everyone accountable before him, even though there's not enough natural awareness of God to lead us to salvation. Now, here's what I believe. Even though the natural revelation does not get us to the destination, it does get us to the point where people can respond and say, okay, I know there's a God. I can't deny that. And so here's what many believe, and I would put myself in this camp, that whenever people naturally respond to God's revelation, that God will always and in every case send someone or make himself more and more available based on their response to him. So if people respond to the light of natural revelation, I believe that God is going to in turn respond and give them more revelation of himself. We'll talk about that more next week because actually it becomes more important in Romans chapter 2. But that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, Renee.
So there's a lot of unnatural acts according to God outside of marriage, adultery and things of that nature.
Right.
Are there acts within the marriage, even though the couple agrees to it, that could be considered unnatural to God?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And look at the time. Yeah, it really is, and it deserves a better answer than what I'm going to give. I think the answer is yes, ultimately, and I think again, And I think that's actually a good example. Not even all desires that may be totally, like our world believes that the necessary and sufficient condition for sexual intimacy is just consent. If I consent, we hear this all the time. If you're a consenting adult, you can do whatever you want with any other consenting adult, right? Well, here's the problem. God has a natural design, not just of marriage, but within marriage. And so, yeah, I think that works itself out in two ways that I will say, even though we're out of time. If there is a sexual act that one person is uncomfortable within marriage, then I think it's off limits within that marriage. But let's say that both people are consenting. I do think there are things that would go outside of even the realm of what is truly natural. And here's what's unfortunate, and I'll just say this as a total aside. That's where the impact of pornography, I think, is so damaging, because what does pornography do? It plants seeds of desire that send you down that path of drifting, which is why, again, so many people, and this is sad and it may be controversial, but it's true, so many people start with some level of porn, but it's never enough. Like, by its nature, it just leaves you, it's like drinking salt water. It just makes you more thirsty. And so what happens as people go on, it either becomes harder core porn, it becomes violent porn, it becomes other kinds of, like, it doesn't stop. And that's what I think the Bible teaches about sexual appetites in general, is that there is an avenue for them to be truly fulfilled. And guess what? And this is why I said earlier, it's not just about your body, it's about the connection of body and heart, which is why even sex within marriage is not about getting, it's about learning to give yourself to someone else for their pleasure and their good. That's a whole, but yeah, I'm 5 minutes over, so I'm going to stop. But if you're here and you're like, okay, I said something, I heard something, I would love to talk with you more. This is where we're at. Like, this is real life. Even though it's 2,000 years ago, this is 2023. So if you're here, I want to talk to you more. I'd love to. We'll pick it up next week. Thank you guys, and we'll see you then.